This particular lecture is going to cover completing problem 2-1. I'm going to go through this problem. I might have to break it up into two sections because when I load it to YouTube, it only allows me 15 minutes each. So I'm going to take my time and really go through this so as if we were in class, you'll have time to absorb the information. Here, as you can see on the screen, I have the problem up. Problem 2-1A. In your books, it's page 81. Degelman Company uses a job order cost system and applies overhead to production on the basis of direct labor costs. On January 1st of 2014, job number 50 was the only job in process. The cost incurred prior to January 1st on this job were as follows. It gives us information about direct materials of $20,000, direct labor of $12,000, and manufacturing overhead of $16,000. As of January 1st, job number 49 had been completed at a cost of $90,000 and was part of finished goods inventory. There was a $15,000 balance in the raw materials inventory account. And then it goes on to tell us that during the month of January, Degelman Company began production on jobs 51 and 52 and completed jobs 50 and 51. Jobs 49 and 50 were also sold on account during the month of January for $122,000 and $158,000 respectively. The following additional events occurred during the month. So it gives us even more information how it purchased additional raw materials of $90,000 on account. It incurred factory labor cost of $70,000. Of this amount, $16,000 related to employer payroll taxes. It incurred manufacturing overhead costs as follows of indirect materials, $17,000, indirect labor $20,000, depreciation $19,000, and other manufacturing overhead costs of $16,000. And then it tells us the direct materials and direct labor as they got assigned to various jobs. Wow! Lots of information, but do not be overwhelmed. They're giving you a lot of information, but remember, we're going to break it down one piece at a time. So hang in there with me. This is our first portion we need to do is A. We're going to calculate the predetermined overhead rate for 2014. Assuming Degelman Company estimates total manufacturing overhead costs of $980, direct labor costs of $700,000, and direct labor hours of 20,000 hours. So the first thing we need to do is determine how are we calculating this predetermined overhead rate. So we're going to go back and look at the information regarding the predetermined overhead rate. And we're going to see here, I just want to, excuse me, as we walk through this, it tells us Degelman applies overhead to production on the basis of direct labor costs. So that tells us that the way we're going to calculate the predetermined overhead rate is on the basis of direct labor costs, not direct labor hours, direct labor costs. So the first thing we're going to do here is get this information we need. And let's open up an Excel and talk about this. So I'm just going to make it real clear what I'm working on so you can follow along. But in A, the goal here is to calculate predetermined overhead rate. Okay, what is it we know? We know that are, let me go back here. I apologize for going back and forth. The total manufacturing overhead cost of $980. So we know the overhead costs are $980,000, and we know that the direct labor costs are $700,000. So if we have the direct labor costs of $700,000, what we know is we're applying the overhead based on direct labor costs. So the predetermined overhead rate is going to be calculated by taking our overhead costs, dividing that by our direct labor costs, which shows to be 1.4. Another way of viewing that is our overhead rate is 140% of our direct labor costs. Another way to look at that is for every dollar in direct labor costs, we're going to have $1.40 as our predetermined overhead rate of the manufacturing overhead costs. So to answer that first question, basically 140% is the predetermined overhead rate based on direct labor costs. Okay, then the next we're going to look at, we'll go back here to the problem, and B tells us open job cost sheets for jobs 50, 51, and 52. Enter the January 1st balances on the job cost sheet for job number 50. So we need to create the job cost sheets for jobs 50, 51, and 52. So let's take a look at that. So if we look at job 50, we have information about that job. Let me just go back here and make sure there was nothing on the first page. Excuse me for... Job 50 was the only job in process. The cost incurred prior to January 1st on this job were as follows. So it tells us the cost showed $20,000 in direct labor, $20,000 in direct materials, $12,000 in direct labor. Manufacturing overhead costs were $16,000. So it started the period with that amount. So let's start and create a job cost sheet here. Job cost sheets, and we'll start this. I'm going to call it job number 50. And for this, we're going to show the date, we're going to have the direct materials, we're going to have direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. And as we begin the period of January, so going into January, it told us the direct materials, $20,000, the direct labor, $12,000, and the manufacturing overhead of $16,000. It provided us with that information going into January. So we're putting that information in. Now what we want to know is the information related to what happened in January. For job number 49, we're not going to mess with that one yet. For January, what was put into the job number 50, direct materials of $10,000 and direct labor of 7,000. Excuse me, of 5,000. So we'll go back here and we're going to show in January we have direct materials of 10,000 we requisitioned and direct labor of 5,000. Now, how are we going to account for the manufacturing overhead? Based on the information that we derived in Part A, we know that the manufacturing overhead is going to be 140% of our direct labor. So we can assume if we take our direct labor here and we multiply it by our predetermined overhead rate, well, let me see what I'm doing wrong here. So if we take our our direct labor there, and we multiply it times our predetermined overhead rate. Boy, oh boy, what am I doing wrong? Okay, so I'm just going to go equals that labor cost times predetermined overhead rate of 1.4 gives us our manufacturing overhead here of 7,000. So we know the direct materials for the period are 30,000. Our direct labor cost are 17,000, and our manufacturing overhead is 23,000. So if we took all these three costs, and I'll create a formula here, or a sum here, we're going to have total costs for job number 50 of 70,000. So that's for job number 50. Let's look at job number 51. So I'm going to basically copy all of this down here, but I'm going to change this to job number 51, and I'll get rid of these figures here. When we look at job number 51, we'll go back here and find that in January they began job number 51, so we're not going into job number 51 with anything from the previous month. They, with job number 51, we show that there were 39,000 in direct materials and 25,000 in direct labor. So if we put in here we had 39,000 here, 25,000 in direct labor, we know that our manufacturing overhead is going to be a result of our direct labor times, again, our predetermined overhead rate of 140%, or 35,000. So job number 51 total costs relate to 99,000, and the way we're coming up with that is nothing was brought into the month, but in January the book shows us the direct materials of 39, the direct labor of 25, and it's our job to compute the predetermined manufacturing overhead based on direct labor of 25,000 times 140%. I'm going to have to stop here and move on to part 2 of this lecture, and you can pick up at that time.